And now for a closer look at this year's local election results, we're joined today by Professor Kim Soo-jin, Professor of Political Theory at Kyung Hee University. Professor Kim, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
So voter turnout for this election was the second highest on record, right? And the results are now in. What do you make of the outcome and what stood out to you the most?
I think there are three major points to note about this year's local election results. Perhaps the first thing to note is the dramatic shift from the local election results in the 2022 local elections, where the Conservative People Power Party won a landslide victory in most parts of South Korea. So yesterday's local election results, by contrast, were precisely the opposite. So as everybody here knows, the Democratic Party won many of the mayoral and gubernatorial races, with the People Power Party taking up just the traditionally conservative southeastern strongholds. And the second point is, of course, the last-minute takeover of Oh Se-hun in the Seoul mayoral race. Oh had been consistently falling behind the opposing candidate Chung Won-oh until ballots from the conservative district in the south of the Han River, Gangnam, Seocho, and Songpa, played a major role in closing the gap. So I think that's the second thing to note about this year's elections. And a third notable and perhaps disappointing fact about this year's local elections was the shortage of ballot papers, of course. And I think this sort of consistent performance of the National Election Commission is in fact, it's a very disappointing fact. And despite the shortage of ballot papers, the National Election Commission declared that there's no sufficient reason to suspend the election results. But nonetheless, it was reported that officials had prepared ballots for only 50% of eligible voters, for example, in Songpa-gu, so based on their projected turnout. And I think that this sort of lack of preparedness is, again, it's a very disappointing fact about this year's elections again.
Right. And beyond determining local leadership, what broader political implications could these election results have for the ruling and opposition parties?
Yes, I think this widespread victory of the Democratic Party in this year's local elections shows the reinforcement of the dominant position of the ruling Democratic Party. And furthermore, I think it shows that a major proportion of the citizenry is actually in support of President Lee's administration and has strong faith in his good performance throughout the remaining years of his presidency.
I see. And this was the first national election under President Lee Jae Myung, right? Do the results suggest strong sort of public support for the administration's policy agenda, or do they point to growing challenges ahead?
So it seems that these results point to a solid public support for President Lee Jae Myung's administration, given the widespread victory of the Democratic Party in many parts of the regions, with the exception of course, the conservative southeastern strongholds. To be exact, the Democratic Party won 12 of the 16 mayoral and gubernatorial races, with the People Power Party just securing victories in only the four traditionally conservative strongholds. And this presents a sort of dramatic shift from the local election results in 2022. And I think it sort of reinforces our impression that, in fact, President Lee Jae Myung has a very high approval rating, and that people in general have a very good impression of his forthcoming performance in the next years ahead.
Right, and today actually marks exactly 1 year since President Lee took office. Looking back on his first year, how much progress do you think he has made in achieving promises he made on the campaign trail? And how would you assess his performance so far?
So to assess President Lee Jae Myung's presidency, I think it's probably important to first recall the promises that he made on his campaign trail. So the first promise that he made was to restore a healthy democracy in South Korea in the aftermath of the martial law crisis. And the other, I think, major sort of goal or promise that President Lee made is to achieve national unity and economic prosperity for everyone across different demographic groups. Now, it seems that with respect to the first goal, restoring a healthy democracy in the aftermath of the martial law crisis, I think most people would agree that, in fact, President Lee has done a very good job of securing national unity and restoring democracy and putting power back into people's hands. And then the second part about achieving economic prosperity for everyone, I think one sort of key factor that probably lies behind the high approval ratings has to do with the unprecedented surge in the Korean stock market, with a Kospi index breaking the 3,000 threshold, which was driven not least by government pushes such as the injection of extra budget and the following optimism in the economy, as well as the return and attraction of foreign investors. So I do think that there are various sorts of factors that lie behind the high positive approval rating of President Lee Jae Myung. And just to cite one of the national public opinion poll that was taken by Real Meter, it was said that Lee's performance people who had a positive outlook on President Lee's performance was approximately 58% and around 35% of disapproval ratings. Now, this seems to be much higher than President Yoon's approval ratings, but slightly lower than President Moon Jae-in's ratings. Now, it's good to note that this is a comparatively high approval rating, in particular if we also take into account the fact that the Korean Gallup poll showed that 70% of Korean citizens predicted that President Lee would perform well in the coming 5 years. So again, just to come back to full circle, there are various sorts of reasons that lie behind this positive approval of President Lee and his performance in the coming years. But one of them has to do with the thriving economy, as well as President Lee's successful efforts to restore democracy and put power back in the hands of the people after the martial law crisis.
Right. And Professor Kim, before I let you go, with the election now over, what do you think will be the main goals for President Lee Jae Myung and his administration moving forward?
So I think one of the main sort of goals that President Lee has to tackle in the coming years has to do with foreign policy, of course. I mean, the global era these days is very complicated, with wars breaking out in various parts of the world, unstable oil prices, and so on. So I think one of the hardest challenges that President Lee will have to confront is, for example, how to deal with trade talks between the United States and South Korea in a way that is sustainable for South Korea's economy in the future. So I think that's one. And then the other goal, which I think is equally important, has to do with restoring national unity and especially closing the polarization between between different demographic groups between, for example, the younger generation, the older generation, as well as between the different socioeconomic groups that currently divides the political climate of South Korea.
Right, definitely. We'll have to see how that goes. All right, Professor Kim, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me again.